Oh man, every time I listen to that, I feel like a jolt of 100,000 volts going through me. Hey, Mitch Bell, welcome to Tall Tales with Taco Bell. Listen, last week we talked to Jeff Hatton about the M1 tank. That really kind of got me going about it. And as a aviator, I know absolutely zip about tanks, but I love tanks. I think armor is cool, and I own a couple armored vehicles, but they are not tanks. They are armored scout vehicles. They just happen to have guns on them. But today we're talking to an old friend of mine. I mean, gosh, I've known Chuck 15 years plus, and he is the president of Hero Labradors. He's a retired major in the U.S. Army and a tanker. Served over in Iraq, and he also served in Afghanistan after his injuries in Iraq. I think they pulled him out of a tank, but he's got some pretty funny stories about that I'm going to touch on. He's going to get embarrassed, but without further ado, I'd like to bring Chuck Ziegenfuss on. How are you, brother?
I am great, Taco. Thanks for having me.
Hey, man, you're looking good, Billy Ray. Listen,
Feeling good.
feeling good, Lewis. Hey, we're alive, 6 feet above ground. Nobody's shooting at us, right?
Yep, it's a great day.
Yeah, no shit. Hey, last week I interviewed Jeff, and Jeff told us all about the M1 tank, which is really cool and fascinating to me because I didn't realize, like, as I was asking questions about the Russian, they have that reactive armor, and I'm like, show a picture of our tanks, and I go, how come we don't have that reactive armor? And I did not realize that there was special stuff built into the tank itself that was like reactive armor stuff, which I find fascinating. And looking at the questions that people asked last night, I'm kind of talk to you, and then also ask some of these questions and incorporate them into our show. Does that work?
It works for me.
All right. So let's go back. I want to know, how did you get all of your tanks into position? Where did you guys load off of? Where'd you come from? Where'd you load off? Because the logistical part of a 60-ton tank is what nobody thinks about. You just all of a sudden show up and you've got tanks. Well, how did you get the tanks from A to B? What happened with you guys?
Okay, well, about a month before we set foot in Kuwait, we did a railhead from Kansas, from Fort Riley. So all of our tanks and trucks and Humvees and everything we were taking with us got put on a train. From there, it went to Savannah, Georgia, to the port. And interesting story there. One of my tanks caught fire when they were trying to put it on the boat. If I'm not mistaken, it was Charlie 3-2. And because my XO was like, "Hey, Chuck," and I was, "Yeah." I came in to see him, and he's like, "Yeah, one of your tanks caught fire."
What? How does a tank catch fire? Somebody leave the heater on, or what?
Yeah, actually, that's exactly what happened. The heater had a fuel leak, and we knew this. Okay, it was one of those, we didn't get a chance to fix it before we deployed. We were going to fix it when we got on the ground in Kuwait. But the civilians that take the stuff off the tank at the railhead and put it on the boats,
yeah,
they didn't know that. And this was right around Christmas time. And so, when my XO told me what happened, I had to go and do an investigation and find out why the tank did X, Y, and Z. And so the first thing I did was I checked the weather in Savannah, because I'm like, well, why the heck are they running the heater in Savannah? Even in December, it's usually warm. Well, it was down in the 50s that morning. I'm like, okay. So they got in, they turned on the heater, and the heater in the driver's compartment is where the fuel leak was. And so after the guy got out, that fuel was dripping on the hot heater, and the tank catches fire. So they pulled it off, and I flew to Savannah and went to the 3rd ID headquarters there at Fort Stewart, and actually talked to the division G4, the head logistician for 3ID. It was sort of overseeing all the railhead part in Savannah. And she was like, "And you're who?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm a company commander. One of my tanks caught fire in the port, and I'm doing an investigation on it, et cetera, et cetera." And she was actually amazed. She's like, "I'm dealing with so much stuff coming back from Iraq that's been damaged or destroyed, and all of the reports and surveys that we have to do, and you're here actually taking care of your property, and I don't have to chase people down. And she goes, this is kind of amazing. But anyway, so that tank, because the filters in the, I'm sorry, it wasn't the crew heater that the guy had used. It was the NBC system. Now we knew that the heater had a fuel leak, and the fuel dripped onto the NBC system filters, which get very hot, and but they can pump out warm air. So that's what the guy was using. And so the fuel dripped on those filters, the whole tank catches fire. And the really bad part about it is that the filters in the NBC system are made out of chromium. I think it's chromium 4 or something like that. Well, once that catches fire, the entire tank becomes a hazmat disaster. So everything has to be coated out. The tank, the machine guns, or not the machine guns, they traveled separately, but all of the equipment that we normally store in the tank, everything is written off. Basically, it has to go back to the Lima tank plant in Ohio, get decontaminated, pulled apart, and becomes a new tank somewhere else. So, so I spent like 4 days before Christmas, right before we deployed, in Savannah, Georgia, which, you know, kind of nice. And then flew back home. And then right after the New Year, I think, we all got on planes in Kansas City and flew to Kuwait. So we get to Kuwait, and our tents are there, and, you know, we're living on a cabal or on a fob like Camp Pennsylvania. Or actually, that's not what it was called anymore, but that's what it was.
Sure.
And and we're there for about a week or so as our equipment starts to come in. Now, when the tanks get to the port in Doha, they are again taken off by contractors, taken off the boats, and they're put onto heavy equipment tractor trailers that can only move during daylight hours in Kuwait. So these things, the tanks start rolling into the fob, and one of the things that we do with the tanks is called a combat drop, where the tracks, where they're normally connected to the transmission, we disconnect that so that the het can just, if it's in combat, hence the name, can drop the ramps and roll backward and then slam on the brakes, and the tank will roll right off. Huh. And then the het can go and run at a higher speed to get away. Well, they're delivering our tanks, and they're combat dropping all of these things. Now, there's a risk to doing that you'll damage the tank. And so I stopped this lieutenant that's running the you know, getting the tanks off the hets. I'm like, hey, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, we're dropping off your hets. I'm like, yeah, it takes like 5 minutes to hook the transmission back up, and we'll drive them off. She said, well, we got to get back before sundown to you know, our base. And I was like, yeah, I don't care about your timeline. There's guest quarters over there if you need billeting, but we're going to do this right. And she starts arguing. And you know, she started to argue with me, and I interrupted her, and I said, sir, right? You realize that you're a second lieutenant talking to a captain? Sir, right? And she's like, yes, sir. I'm like, yeah, we're going to do this right. You're not going to break my tanks. And she's like, well, time. And I'm like, it takes 5 minutes. You'll be out of here in 15 minutes. And she was. You know, we got all our tanks off except for Charlie 3-2. So for Charlie 3-2, every division has a float platoon. And these are just vehicles that are not assigned to any unit. They don't have a crew. They just are, you know, combat replacement spares for all intents and purposes. Right. So we grew one of those, and that replaced the Charlie 3-2 tank that we took north into Iraq about 4 days later. So while we were in Doha, we had to, you know, get all of our vehicles and make sure that they were mechanically sound. We drew ammo. We went to the range. It was the first time we got to shoot the MPAT rounds, which was pretty cool. The multi-purpose anti-tank round, which has a proximity fuse or a point target fuse. So we fired those just to familiarize with them. We test fired all of our machine guns, et cetera, drove back to the base camp, and a couple of days later loaded everything up, this time on civilian equipment trailers. So still heavy trailers, but these are more like the jingle trucks that are pulling a tank that weighs 70 tons. They have no business pulling. but it's
Yeah.
what, was contracted for. Like you'd see the front of the cab, literally the front two wheels come up off of the ground as the trailer was being loaded. And high adventure kind of stuff. And then we go up to Navistar, which is right at the border of
Wait, back that up.
Iraq.
I want to ask a question. You watch tank fails on Facebook. You get sucked into these rabbit holes, or on
Mhm.
YouTube, and you watch the tank driving up onto the trailer, and then it falls off the side.
Mhm.
How do you guys get like the best driver, and you have that guy load the tanks, or is it up to each guy? And how do you direct the dudes up there without falling off the side of the trailer?
Okay, well, yeah, what normally happens is you'll have every tank driver, that's one of the things they have to be able to do is get up onto that trailer,
Mhm.
because you can't have one guy that drives 14 tanks.
Yeah.
So what'll happen is a person will stand on the trailer itself and guide the guy up onto the first set of ramps. But the tank sort of it starts to elevate as it goes up those ramps,
Can't see him.
and you
Sure.
lose sight of the guy standing on the end of the trailer. So when that happens, an experienced driver can just, edge up until the tank levels out and you can see again. An inexperienced driver, or especially when you're using those civilian heads, you stand on the cab of the truck so the driver can see you, and you continue to guide him on. Now with those civilian trucks where the front lifts off, well, once the tank hits level again, the front of the head slams back down, so you lose like 3 feet of your footing, just drops out from underneath you. So it was
Right.
always fun to watch the guys on the cabs just fall. Sometimes they'd like just fall to their feet. Sometimes they'd land on their butts. Sometimes it was the little dudes in the man dresses that were falling, and they would just tumble all the way off of the truck, and they'd get back up, and they thought it was the funnest thing in the world. But yeah, so loading onto the heads, that's a driver task, and there's a ground guide or two, or sometimes three, that talk them through it. Usually, when you see the tanks that go off the side, yeah, they're not ground guiding; they're just saying, "All right, you got it, get on that thing," because the Army hets are. I think you've got like half of the track on each side hanging off the edge of the trailer.
Jeez.
So you've got to be lined up right, you've got to pay attention, and you've got to get on it's not a fast process getting on the trailer.
Sure. So now, where did you guys go from there?
So from Kuwait, we went up to Navistar, which is right there at the border.
And what year is this?
This was 2005.
Okay.
And we then proceeded, I think it was like a 400-mile road march that we did with, fuel stops along the way, driving all day. And because you have to leave during the day. So my release time, we went by company. My release time was like in the afternoon. And of course, right as we get to Navistar, my supply truck breaks down. That was Charlie 9, I think, or Charlie 4. I had the only long bed 5-ton in the battalion was my supply, but it kind of had issues, like for the life of the truck. And me and my first sergeant, we were like, we might screw up everything else that we do on this deployment, but Charlie 4 is gonna make it to the fob, right? Well, so Charlie 4 breaks down. Or no, it wasn't Charlie 4 that broke down. I'm sorry. Charlie 4, we get right across the border, or it didn't want to start at the border. We finally got it started, and like losing daylight, right? We do not want to leave the next day. So we get Charlie 4 started, get across the border, and we're like a mile over the border. And another deuce and a half that we had traveling with us from a maintenance support team breaks down. And this is an actual deuce and a half. We're talking like Vietnam era truck. So this thing breaks down. So we have to stop. And the tanks, by the way, are all going on these civilian trailers, right? So they are going up in a completely separate echelon than what I've got. I've got a whole bunch of trucks from like headquarters and the rest of the battalion. And a lot of the logistics trail is what I'm escorting up into Iraq. And so deuce and a half breaks down. We get it winched up backwards because the back wheels had locked up. So we had to lift the back up off the ground and attach it to a Hemet wrecker. And then we had to strap down the driver's or the steering wheel so that the truck wouldn't whittle all over the road. And my first sergeant had to watch that for the next like 12 hours. It was the most boring drive of his life. Meanwhile, I'm all the way up at the front of the column, you know, trying to navigate on a paper map and a Garmin GPS that, even though it had the Iraq map loaded, every time you look at the GPS, there's like no terrain features or anything to guide off of. It's like, I'm on this road. I think I'm in the right spot. Let's keep going. And so we drive and we drive and we drive, and it gets dark and the road ends and there's like a goat trail going through the desert. And I'm looking at the map and I'm looking at the overlay and the Garmin, and I'm like, yeah, okay, well, just roll with it. Let's go. And so like for the next 40 miles, we don't see so much as an electric light at night in the desert. And, you know, hoping that my plugger and my GPS are right, the map is good, and I'm going where I'm supposed to be going. And then all of a sudden, boom, we pop up at the, you know, we see lights in the distance, and we drive up, and it's sure enough, it's our first refueling point. And we are like bone dry when we roll into this thing. And because of that trip through the desert, it was very slow going. So what had normally been scheduled for like a 5-hour stop for rest, fuel, food, etc., we had like 2 hours.
And you guys use NVGs going through the desert?
No, this was all white light. I'm thinking, yeah, it was white light, but it, you know, it's so dark and there's no terrain features. You're just staring at wide open desert, you know, so really you can only see the end of your lights.
Now, how come you guys didn't leave tanks in place and just rip TOA with somebody else's tanks that were over there?
Well, ideally we would, but no. Well, that really depends. And we replaced, for instance, an engineer company or an engineer battalion with my battalion. So they didn't have tanks for us to fall in on. A lot of times what you'll do is you'll draw tanks from Doha, the APS fleet, and that's what you'll take north. But those were already out in country. You know, this is 2005, the height of Sadr City being a nightmare, Fallujah, all this other stuff. So everybody had their tanks, and so we were replacing a unit that didn't have tanks. So that's why we were taking ours. And also, after a year in combat, those tanks really need some love maintenance-wise. So we would bring your tanks and replace the ones that the other unit was using anyway. So they would drag them back. So anyway, we get refueled and everything, and I'm talking to the division safety guy. I'm like, look, I've been here for, you know, an hour, and I got to roll out in an hour, and my guys are exhausted. And he's like, yep, that sucks, but you're going to keep going. So we drive, we meet up with our escorts at this point from the unit we're replacing, and we drive another like 6 hours. With, you know, the occasional maintenance breakdown or traffic jam or whatever. And we're like fresh in country. So everything that we look at is a threat. And everybody's keyed up. We get to the fob and they're like, okay, cool. All you need to do once you're here, we park the vehicles, we link up with our counterparts, and they're like, we're going to take you somewhere, get you a bite to eat, and let you go to sleep. And I think I slept soundly that very first night in Iraq because I was just exhausted from 2 days of travel. But we get there and our tanks are, you know, they roll in the next morning. We do some maintenance on those and we start signing for the engineer battalion's equipment. Like, you know, I had 14 tanks. I also had 14 Humvees that I had to sign for.
Well, okay. So you get all that because, I mean, God, logistically, we could talk for probably hours. Your first combat drive in the tank, hit the highlights on that. The first time you took it outside the fob and engaged in combat.
Well,
how did they utilize you with the troops, and what was your role?
Well, I was a company commander, and usually when we rolled out of the fob, and probably the first combat, not the first combat, the very first patrol I was on, we find a couple of landmines, and the engineers were like, "Oh yeah, that's a mine," and I'm like standing 3 feet away from it, and I realized that this thing I'm looking at is an anti-tank mine that, you know, I've been trained to identify. But I'm just like, holy shit, that's a mine. And the first thing you do is you look at your feet. Like, am I standing on a mine? But if you were standing on a mine, you wouldn't be there anymore. And so I talked to my counterpart. I was like, hey, is that a landmine? He's like, holy shit, yeah, it is. And so he calls over to his platoon sergeant, and being engineers, they've always got C4 on them somewhere.
Right.
And they're like, we're going to blow it in place, and we move over, and boom, it goes off, and okay, the area is clear. But the first time we take the tanks out, it's really, speaking with authority, because we would roll out usually with 4 tanks from a platoon, and then I would have a tank, my XO would have a tank. So figure 6 tanks and another platoon's worth of Humvees. So you've got 4 Humvees, my first sergeant's Humvee, so 5 trucks, maybe have a medic truck with us, maybe have, whoever we attached, but we roll out with about 6 tanks deep. And the difference being, when we brought the tanks out, we generally weren't bringing them out to play. It wasn't like, oh yeah, we're just going to do a patrol. Now there were times that we took the tanks out just to exercise them, just to show like presence, show the flag kind of thing.
Show force, sure.
Yeah, but if we brought the tanks out to conduct an operation, that was when we increased the aggression and the violence. We one time our Iraqi counterpart company's headquarters was under attack, and we rolled tanks. And as soon as the tanks hit about 2 miles from the Iraqi company headquarters, the insurgents' lookouts were like, hey, there's tanks coming. And that ended the battle right there. They just started to hightail it. Well, we had to chase them. And the only thing is that, you have to be careful where you're throwing that 120 when you're chasing cars and things like that. But you've got a 50 caliber, and you've got a couple of 240 7.62 machine guns to work with as well. And you've got the front of the tank. The front slope is usually your primary weapon in that kind of environment. We had a vehicle stopped in the road. We identified that it had IED components in it. And my boss was like, yeah, just go ahead and drive over it. All right, sir. And so the OH-58 Kiowa gunship or Kiowa Scout rather, that was sort of guiding us into where the bad guys were. He's like, hold on, can you wait a minute? And I'm like, yeah, why? He goes, I got to get gun camera of this. So he buzzed around, came back. He's like, all right, I'm set. I'm recording. Now run over this car. And we did. And we took a normal car, and we made it about 1.5 feet high. And then, and we knew who the car belonged to, right? It belonged to a local sheikh who was really a shithead. And so we took and hooked it up to a tow chain, and we dragged it back to his house and just left it there. Other times, it was breaking through a wall with it, or nothing says I don't want to get into an urban fight with a bad guy like just driving your tank into the building that he's in. And it's the best way to clear a room.
But I've always heard tankers don't like driving into buildings because you never know if there's a basement.
Right. And that was a thing that we were kind of out in a more rural area most of the time. And so a lot of the times the houses wouldn't have basements, but they would have a septic, for lack of a better word, a septic tank. Usually it was a covered but open pit near the building. So we wouldn't drive like all the way into the building ever, but breaching that outer wall with the tank is always a great way of saying hi. I'm not going to breach the door. I'm just going to take out this section of your living room. And it's a great way to knock or a great way to enter a room when everybody's focused on those fatal funnels, and you just create your own window. At times we were using the tanks for highway security. Another fun thing when you have a vehicle-borne IED drive into your tank and blow up, and everybody that's inside the tank is like, hey, I think something just blew up outside. And
no way, you guys, I mean, what with the headsets on and whatnot?
Oh, yeah. You've got the engine noise, you've got the Bose headsets on, which are noise canceling anyway, and there's explosion right outside the tank, and you're like, hey, something just blew up outside. You hear a bong, you feel the shock, but it's not like this huge thing. I mean, you got to realize when the tank gun fires, when the main gun fires, it's really not that loud inside the turret. So
I can't believe that.
It's amazing, really. I mean, you hear clanging from the aft cap being ejected from the gun, from the cycling of the gun, but you really don't hear the boom as nearly as loud as it is outside of the tank.
Right.
Which is just always been fascinating to me. But yeah, we had a VBID blow up outside of one of the tanks. My tank, we actually were driving and found an IED. We saw the trigger wire going across the road, and this was we investigated the IED, and it was a can of G, the clarified butter, that's probably 1.5 foot rectangle by about 1.5 foot high, and it filled with PE4, and the detonator was in there and everything else. And so the engineer guy was like, "Yeah, we can just blow it in place, but it's probably better if we burn it." And I'm like, "Well, okay, burn it." And so they put a smoke grenade on it, which lights the PE4.
What's PE4 for everybody out there?
It's basically a homemade
C4?
or Russian type version of C4. So the smoke grenade ignites the PE4, which burns really hot but doesn't explode. And I'm standing behind my tank, and we're not even 50 yards away from this thing burning. And I'm standing there, I'm talking to my first sergeant. I peek around the edge of the tank, and right as I pull my head back where it was burning, the PE4 burned down to the blasting caps, which cooked off, which set off the IED. And so there was this huge boom. And, I had just pulled my head back around the edge of the tank. So I was like, holy crap. And my gunner sticks his head out of the tank. And he's like, "Hey, sir, what just happened?" And that was it. Nobody inside the tank was like even remotely aware. I think the driver was still asleep. And so when we talk about the fight in the Ukraine with these things, and you mentioned the reactive armor, inside the turret of a US M1 is on the front glacis, the front slope of the turret, is depleted uranium plates. And what those plates give in terms of protection is about the same as if you were trying to shoot through the side of a World War II battleship.
Wow.
The density of that depleted uranium versus the density of steel is incredible. Now, my understanding is the tanks that we are sending to Ukraine are a model that will not have those depleted uranium plates. I imagine they'll have another. Yeah, the export version will have probably steel, hardened steel in it, or tungsten or something like that. So they won't have quite the same amount of protection. However, they will still be proof against, obviously, RPGs. My tank was hit with several RPGs, and one time we heard it hit the tank, and my loader was like, "Hey, I think we just got hit by an RPG," and that was it. They literally scored the paint.
Wow. And are the guys on the outside radioing you and telling you, hey, Chuck, you just got hit on your left side, bad guys are at 10 o'clock.
You're watching out for, because the Achilles heel in a tank or in any armored vehicle really is what you can see when you're all inside. Right. And so, we watch for each other, and we look for the enemy, and hey, you got shot at from this direction, and then you're slinging your turret over there to see what shot at you and made you angry, because now you got to put some more paint on the outside of the tank, or whatever. And one of the things that was fun in Iraq was we had a lot of palm groves in our area, and the palm trees, it's like running over a red cockaded woodpecker in a training area, because these things have been there for 100 or 200 years, and it's a major form of income for the sheikhs that own the palm groves, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't want to just go willy-nilly knocking down trees. But when you have a sheikh that is a bad guy, or when you get shot at from a palm grove, well, that's when you make Chuck angry. And so that's when things like ground impact illumination happens. That's when we drive the tanks in, and I don't care about your trees. And we just knock them out of the way with the tank. And it's driving through a palm grove with tanks that are going up against trees that are 2 feet wide. They just knock them the hell down. And we did that several times. One, we had an OH-58 that got shot down in a palm grove, and guys were trying to cut their way through the palm groves, through the underbrush and everything else to get to this crew. Unfortunately, the crew didn't survive the crash, but at one point I was like, you know what, just put the plow down. We had plow tanks and roller tanks, and I said, just put the plow down and go, just get to that helicopter. And so that's what we did, and it looked like Godzilla stomping through the trees because they're all just falling one after another. But we got to that. We went from, making progress by the hour to being on the objective in a minute.
That's
it was
amazing.
absolutely amazing. And that's where, your rules of engagement and your cultural sensitivities and your economic sensitivities and everything, there comes a time when you just make the command decision of, I don't care, I'm getting to the Americans.
Yeah.
And that's really how I fought. That's how my boss was. He was like, I don't care what we have to break to keep our people happy or to keep our people safe.
Mm-hmm.
We threw a lot of when the bullets start flying, you have rules of engagement, but you really you have to realize that a tank is not a delicate instrument. And if people decide they want to mix it up with the tank, then they get the not delicate instrument answer. So, it's sort of like, if you shoot at a B-52 and all he's got to defend himself are 500-pound bombs, you're getting 500-pound bombs.
Right. Right.
So that's kind of the way it was. And violence of action is one of the things that we would pride ourselves on. And the doctrinal use of the tank is to provide fire maneuver and shock effect when engaging the enemy. And shock effect is achieved by being able to move rapidly while shooting and causing everything around your enemy to go boom. Just shocking them into immobility, basically, and then destroying them.
Now, how would you rate the tank in urban environment? I mean, Iraq, obviously they weren't doing the drones dropping hand grenades, which when you're buttoned up, it's not going to affect you. But how would you rate the tank in action in an urban environment like that?
Well, we've done a lot of upgrades to the tank specifically for urban environments. Like they've put armored glass all around the commanders and the loaders' hatches, so they can still be up and see. Because, like I said, your ability to see in a tank when you're all buttoned up is very reduced. But in an urban fight, armor is absolutely crucial because you have a 360-degree battlefield. And I would rate the Abrams as an absolutely stellar platform if it's used right. If you allow your troops to use that violence of action, if you're being shot at from a building, then shoot back and use that 120 millimeter cannon, use that canister round or the multi-purpose anti-tank round, the impact explosive round, to punch big old holes in that building. Are you going to shoot through the building and probably hit somebody on the far side that has nothing to do with the fight? Yeah, you probably are. But if you get shot at from building 1 and you destroy building 1, A, you don't have to worry about anybody in building 1 shooting at you ever again. And B, you don't have to, the people in building 2 are much less likely to shoot at you.
So 120 millimeter round, did you guys have like beehive rounds like they used to shoot in World War II with the flechettes and, like
we didn't have a flechette round, but they did come out with the canister round, which is, it holds 1,000, I believe they're 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch tungsten steel balls.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a big shotgun shell. And we've got, impact explosive rounds. We've got high explosive anti-tank rounds. All of those are great for shooting at buildings and hardened structures. That's what they're for. The Sabo round, obviously, what you'd shoot at an armored vehicle, or especially at a tank, not real good at buildings because you're just going to go through the next 12 buildings.
Right.
And I mean, you could, but you're not going to have the effect that you need on your target. But the tanks have to fight in tandem with at least a pair watching each other. And the support for those tanks, the infantry and everything else, the tank is basically going to be a big bullet magnet. The enemy is going to be shooting at the tank, which allows the infantry to maneuver around and clear buildings and things like that without being the primary target the entire time they're outside. Now, top attack RPGs, things like that coming down on top of the tank, yeah, absolutely, that's a bigger threat. But for every RPG that kills a tank, there's going to be 13 other tanks behind it that are now mad that their buddies got shot.
Yeah.
So, you have to work in tandem with the infantry that have better eyes, better ability to elevate or depress their gun with the Bradley, or with, even the infantry that are on the ground, dismounted. You all have to work in tandem. One piece of the pie isn't going to be the answer that you need in an urban environment. And it's really not the answer that you need on any battlefield, but especially in an urban environment.
Well, how about, what are your impressions of watching the conflict over in the Ukraine? As you're watching the Russians and how they employ their T-80s, T-72s, whatever, their tanks, armor systems. What's your impression on that as a tanker?
Well, they don't mass anywhere, and that's really the beauty of armor is it brings mass to the battlefield. One of the principles of warfare. And so every time I see the armor moving in these clips, it's usually one tank with 2 or 3 armored vehicles, which is what we would normally consider a platoon or a combat security outpost. And or maybe you'll see 2 tanks together with a couple of other vehicles, but you don't see companies of armor moving. And I think that's probably a logistics issue, both in terms of fuel and repair parts and things like that. And it's also in terms of they're not really attacking to seize. They'll attack with infantry. They'll attack with some of their mechanized vehicles, but they really aren't moving their armor. And that may be because they're worried about it just all being destroyed because there's so many javelins in the woods these days. Or it may just be that they don't want to employ it, or it's not really in their doctrine to employ armored vehicles in urban areas. And that's a direct result of what happened to them with the Chechens in Grozny, where the Russians lost an entire armor brigade in a day inside of a city.
Really? I didn't know about that. What happened there?
Oh, the Battle of Grozny was amazing. So the Russians went in to Grozny to recapture the city from the Chechen rebels. And most of the Chechens had served in the Russian army. And so they had set up in basements where the tanks couldn't depress their main gun, and they had set up on top of buildings and in higher elevations that the tank main gun couldn't reach when they were close. And they just waited, and they waited until this entire armored column had moved into the city. And then they killed the vehicles at both ends. And then throughout the day, either with RPGs or with IEDs or with Molotov cocktails or whatever, they systematically destroyed a Russian brigade, like defeat in detail. And then the Russians, they pulled everybody out of the city and they surrounded it with artillery and turned it into rubble. Which is another good way of dealing with insurgents in cities. But again, you have to have the stomach to do it, or the will. And they're not doing that kind of a thing in Chechnya, or in the Ukraine. They started to at first, but then they learned a hard lesson again that, people that know this terrain and know how to fight are going to fight you. Yeah. It doesn't matter how long the invader stays in the country. The people that don't want the invader there are always going to force them out. A lesson that they should have learned in Afghanistan, a lesson we should have learned in Afghanistan. If somebody attacked the United States, say China, say they dropped 100, balloons full of people in the United States and captured a large section of, I don't know, California. Well, no, California is a bad example. They captured a large section of New Mexico. Yeah. How long or how much would the people in that section that they caught fight against them? Even if they built schools and churches and roads and everything else, how long would those people be like, no, we still want to be Americans. We're going to fight you. When would they finally say, you know what, these folks, they're not that bad. We'll just do what they say. We'll give up our freedoms. No, they won't. Lesson that we should learn in any environment where we're seen as the invader, where we're taking over in a less than friendly population. A lesson that we didn't learn in Iraq, a lesson we didn't learn in Afghanistan. And the other side of that is, okay, if I'm the invader and I want a secure area that has a civilian population, then I have to have that civilian population understand that aggression against us is going to be met with tenfold aggression.
Yeah, but that's the Russians do have that mindset, and they just don't care. Whereas we would go in and we would have to build a couple schools and try to get them to vote.
Right.
Pour tons of money.
Their entire way of life. But the Russians are very willing to go in and say, no, we're just going to kill people and break things. Unfortunately, because of graft in their ranks, because of lack of maintenance, they lost most of their logistics train in the initial pushes because of tires being old and worn from the vehicles not being exercised. Even though they said, oh yeah, we're doing these maneuvers, blah, 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 on paper, they weren't doing it. And it was obvious because these old tires are dry rotted. These supply vehicles and support vehicles are getting trapped on roads, which blocks all of your logistics ways, which made great targets for the artillery and the aircraft.
Yeah.
And that's the big support, or the big problem, I think, with Russian forces in Ukraine is they do not have the ability to push forward because of their logistics constraints.
It makes me wonder, our big threat, you and I growing up, was, the Russians. I mean, I can remember back in '88, Cold War stuff, and it was the mission of the Marine Corps is to kill as many of the godless communist bastards and their subhuman, immoral cohorts as possible with the least expenditure of munitions, and to integrate all supporting arms into restoring cave dwelling as a permanent way of residence in the former communist region. I mean, that's what we grew up on, the doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're looking at the Russians getting their asses kicked. And I often think now, as I watch these YouTube rabbit holes, what would happen if they had actually gone up against NATO and all of our troops in Germany that constantly are doing exercises and stuff like that, how we would fare against a peer army.
Well, they would have absolutely had their asses handed to them. The Russians would. And I think if we had done that, there probably would have been an expenditure of tactical nuclear weapons on the Russian side, just so that they, didn't lose everything. And what we learned in Iraq and in, Iraq 1 or Gulf War 1 and Gulf War 2 and 3, whatever iteration we're on now, what we learned was that the Russian tactics versus our tactics, which is how the Iraqis fought to a degree, are terrible. And we had some really smart guys in the 70s and 80s that figured out if we execute like this, we'll destroy them. And we did. The T-72, believe it or not, has the most accurate rifle in the world, the 125 millimeter on the T-72, most accurate gun out there. Unfortunately, it only has a range of 2,500 meters, and their optics aren't great.
Yeah,
our tanks have a range of 4,000 to 5,000 meters with direct fire, and our optics are stellar. So when you have 1,500 meters of standoff range, you can sit there and destroy T-72s all day long.
Right.
And when I say our tanks, that includes the Leo, that includes the Challenger. Those tanks are great tanks, and they were all designed pretty much by the same folks. Our tank has a German gun and British armor, I think, American optics, like the Chobham armor that's on the British tank is also on the hull of the Abrams, and I'm pretty sure on the hull of the Leo. So it was sort of a group effort, everything that we built into that platform, and it's all very similar for the same reasons. So whether it's British tanks or Russian or I'm sorry, British tanks or German tanks or tanks that we gave to Poland or whatever, the Russians really don't want to meet that kind of armored force. And we always trained, back in the 80s and 90s, platoon kills a battalion. That was how we trained. An armor platoon, U.S. armor platoon in the defense should have a 90% or better kill ratio against a Russian battalion.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when you do that kind of math and you say, okay, well, we're sending 30 tanks or 40, what they say, 46 tanks, something like that. Mm-hmm. That's a battalion plus 2 spares. It's a pure battalion plus 2 spares. So you're looking at 12 platoons. If each one of those kills a battalion, you're looking at 1 battalion would kill a division.
Jeez. If they can keep them operating and working, and the supply lines and all that stuff too.
Oh yeah, make no mistake about it. General Dynamics is going to make a ton of money off of supporting these vehicles, because the logistics tail for an Abrams is huge, and you've got basically the German and the British tanks do not have, if I'm not mistaken, do not have the diesel turbine like in the Abrams, so they have their own diesel engines. And there is a little bit of commonality in parts, but not much. So you're going to have 3 different lines or logistics lines to support those 3 different platforms.
Yeah, you got a jet engine or something in yours, right?
What's that?
You have like a jet engine in the M1.
The AGT 1500 is a diesel turbine. It's, from what I understand, pretty much the same engine that's on, I think, the F-16.
Wow. Without
the afterburners. Because they wouldn't do much. Yeah. But yeah, you talk about having power on demand. But the other side of that coin is it drinks fuel from a fire hose, miles to the gallon, and each tank, if I'm not mistaken, holds like 1,200 gallons of fuel. And after a day's operation, you're on empty. You get about 300 or so kilometers out of maneuvering with that much gas. So a lot of trips to the fuel point, a lot of trips from the fueler to the tank. And then there's beans and bullets and parts and mechanics and everything else that you need just to keep that operational on a daily basis. And the same thing applies to a lesser degree to the Russians. The real hurdle is maintenance on the offense. Russian tanks, pretty much anything mechanically wrong with it, if you can work on a tractor, you can work on a Russian tank. Mm-hmm. They're pretty simple. The downside of that is they're pretty easy to destroy with another tank, with a much higher technological edge in the Abrams and in the Leo and in the Challenger than there is in the T-72. Literally built in 1972 and upgraded since then. Ours, the experimental platform, came out in 1980 and then was adopted, made changes, and we're on. Let's see. You had the M1, you had the M1 IP, which is an improved platform. Then you had the M1 A1 come out. Then you had the M1 A1 Charlie, the M1 A1 Heavy Common, the M1 A2, the M1 A2 SEP, the M1 A2 SEP Gen 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've had like 9 iterations of this tank, and we expect this platform to be usable through 2050 with upgrades. Wow. So it's really like the B-52 of tanks. We're never going to get rid of it. We're just going to keep upgrading.
Yeah.
And the logistics for all of that, luckily we're only sending them 1 model of tank, instead of 2 or 3 or 4 different versions. They'll have the British version, they'll have the German version, they'll have our version. And they're each going to come with their own logistics
package,
parts, maintenance, missions, etc., keeping it running. But yeah, it's going to be huge. $100 billion is nothing compared to what that's going to cost. Yeah. Now, what it can do for them is they can put those tanks and draw a line and say, you're not going any farther than this. And then when the Russians are weak, those tanks move in and they're saying, now you're leaving, and you'll probably be walking back across that bridge into Russia. Now, if NATO had entered the fray at the outset and put tanks on the border, and even an airborne brigade on the border, just dropped a bunch of paratroopers in with javelins, Russians would never have invaded. Would never have done it. One, much bigger incident when you're killing the Americans that are there as peacekeepers. or the NATO troops that are there as peacekeepers, and two, when they have not only the technological equipment but the skill to use it properly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Russians would have never invaded, which makes me wonder why we didn't do that. Why didn't our president have the political will to do what would, in effect, have saved a ton of money and a ton of lives?
Well, that's a discussion for another day, right?
Yeah. I mean, maybe his Joint Chiefs, like the balloon, said, no, we just need to wait.
Yeah.
And he said, no, go in and save these people. He was like, nah, we'll just wait.
Yeah. Wait and see what happens. But
Yeah.
hey, Chuck, you better take your COVID shot before you paratroop in there, because we want you to be safe.
Right.
It's safe and effective. But I digress. Go take everybody back. When was your live day? When did you get hit?
I was wounded on 21 June of 2005. Basically, in the movie Apocalypse Now, never get off the boat.
Yeah.
Yeah, never get off the tank. We got a notification. The guy came up to one of the police checkpoints and said, hey, there were some guys screwing around over by this bridge. We think there's an IED over there. Took the tank over, got eyes on the bridge, scanned it with optics, scanned the area, looking for anybody hanging around that shouldn't have been. Didn't see anything. And then the last thing you want to do before you roll a tank over a bridge is clear the bridge. And so I got off the tank, got a couple of other guys, and we were walking across the bridge. And there was an IED that was buried under the asphalt. And a little piece of antenna sticking up out of the asphalt, and it blew up about 3 feet from where I was standing. So
how big was it?
It was an 81 millimeter mortar round that was buried under the ground. So not terribly big, but not something you want to stand next to when it goes off.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, probably yay big around. And it went off, and I got blown off of the bridge that I was standing on and into a canal, and was unconscious. And my XO jumped in the canal once everybody sat up and was like, what the hell just happened? They were like, well, where's the scale? Yeah. And so my XO ran over to the edge of the bridge, saw my boots in the water, jumped in, pulled me to the side. One of my Iraqi counterpart soldiers was right there and pulled me up out of the canal, which was great because, I had all my body armor on. I wasn't in any kind of functioning capacity mentally. Mm-hmm. And I would have most certainly drowned in that canal. By the way, drainage canals in Iraq are not the place you want to be with open wounds.
Yeah, I was thinking you survive the initial blast and you die of sepsis,
Oh, yeah. I had it all. I had MRSA. I had a multi-drug resistant organism. They still don't know what it is, but, hit me with every antibiotic on the planet. But, yeah, and so I get up out of the water. I'm starting to get my wits about me. I walk over to the Humvee. I look at my XO, and I was like, am I still pretty? Do I still have my junk? And I mean, literally, that's what I said. And, I didn't get a humorous chuckle or anything back. And I looked down, and everywhere that there isn't body armor is bleeding. Yeah. And I'm like, well, that's not good. And so I grabbed the hand mic in my truck, in my Humvee, which always followed wherever I was in the tank, because often as a commander, you have to jump from one to the other and go and do. So I grabbed the hand mic on the radio, called battalion, said, we've got one WIA IED blast, this location. Sent the 9-line medevac, and they're like, who is the person that got wounded? And I'm like, that's my Charlie Zulu 5087 is the battle roster number. And my boss is like, you okay? And I'm like, nah, you should probably send a helicopter. And then I just sat down, and I was out at that point. I'm like, yeah, get the medic over here.
You weren't in shock. You were in shock at that
I was absolutely in shock.
Yeah.
Because I was walking around with all of this, gore on me, and losing blood and everything else. And I had a collapsed lung. I had, my eardrums were blown out. I could barely see because my eyeballs, literally the eyeball and the retina, were bruised. I had parts missing from one hand. My other hand was broken and shredded. My legs were torn open, and I'm just walking around, calling in my medevac, and then the medics rush up and they get me pretty much to where I'm sitting down, And I'm like, I can't breathe. And they're, they're working to pull off my body armor. And we had the cool armor that you pull the string and everything just, no, we didn't have that yet. We didn't have it falls apart. And so they're trying to like pull it off and work it around my head and my arms and everything. I'm like, just cut it. And they were like, sir, and I was like, just cut it off. It's just money. I don't care, And so then they cut off the body armor and they're like, okay, so everywhere that there was body armor, not a mark on it. Everywhere that there wasn't, plenty of marks. But the one of the pieces of the IED actually hit the front SAPI plate in my body armor and broke it. And that's what collapsed my left lung.
Wow.
Yeah. And so helicopter shows up. And the only thing I remember from when the helicopter arrived is my fister, which is a fire support team guy, basically an attachment to the company that's an artilleryman for calling in fires. So my forward observer, fister, he's carrying the back of the litter that I'm laying on, right? And so I'm looking at him. And I just keep repeating over to him, don't you fucking drop me. Don't you fucking drop me, because I'm like, I hurt. Don't drop. He was like, I got you, sir. And I just kept repeating that over and over as they're putting me on the helicopter. And they get me on the helicopter, and the medics on the helicopter are working on me, and they're like, do you want morphine? And I'm like, are you kidding me? Because my medics, a couple weeks prior to this, one of the medics in the battalion had lost his morphine. And so the PA was like, that's it. Collect up all the morphine. That's a major incident, right? So they collected up all the morphine and took it from the medics. So when I'm laying there bleeding on the ground in Iraq, my medic comes rushing up, and the strongest thing he could give me was Motrin.
Oh my God. And
I'm like, yeah, give me a cigarette. And he's like, sir, we think you have a collapsed lung, and cigarette would cause your pulse and your blood pressure to drop. And I was like, yeah, don't care. Give me a cigarette. Unless you have morphine in that bag, give me a cigarette. He was like, oh, okay. And so, there I am trying to kill myself while surviving being killed. Anyway, they put me on the helicopter, get me to FOB Warhorse, which was the first level 1 trauma place, I think.
Yeah.
And I flatline as they're getting me off of the helicopter and into the treatment facility. That was it. My body was like, yeah, we're done. They get me restarted, get me patched up. And somewhere between then and the next few hours, transport me to Balad, again by helicopter. In Balad, they patched me up a little bit more. I remember talking to my boss, who had come, the 4-hour drive to Balad, who had come to check on me. Great guy. Oscar Hall was probably one of the best battalion commanders a guy could ask for. Definitely the old school, bare knuckle kind of a fighter that you wanted, not a politician. And anyway, Oscar's there, checks on me. I talked to him briefly, crack some jokes because that's just the way I am. And the next day, they put me on a plane to Germany. And once you go on the plane, if you're in a certain level of critical care, like I was, you fly with an entire surgical team. So you've got, your surgeons, your anesthetists, your nurses, the whole 9 yards. Well, again, on the way to Germany, flatline. And they get me restarted again. Next thing I know, I'm waking up in Germany, and the doctor's telling me everything that's wrong with me, everything that they've fixed. And, hey, we found your thumb. We put it back on. That's always pleasant. Trying to explain just how bad the injuries are. And I look at them, I'm like, okay, when can I go back? And, it's one of those things where they just stare at you like, dude, you're out of the fight.
Yeah.
But, he was like, well, you've got to go back to DC and blah, blah, blah. And I'm super, super out of it because, they were just filling me with pain meds. And I remember meeting some friends of ours that, Mrs. Gray Hawk and Mary Ann.
Yeah.
I think I met them. Pretty sure I met them. Or it may have just been a drug-induced dream, but I'm pretty sure I met both Mary Ann and Mrs. G. And they fly me to DC. Luckily, I didn't die on the flight to DC, but again, I was flying with my own surgical team, my very own. And it's not like one surgical team for every guy that's all banged up on the airplane. It's one per banged up guy.
Yeah, you're on a T-17 with the stations.
Yeah,
they've got those mobile portable station operating deals. Yeah, pretty
Yeah.
impressive.
And luckily they kept me knocked out for the whole flight. I get to DC and I remember being on the bus from the airfield to the hospital. And no, wait. No, I was not on the bus from the airfield to the hospital. I flew. They transported me by helicopter from the airfield to the hospital, but they had to put me on a bus to get me from where the helicopter landed to the hospital. So we ended up going just in front of, or near the front gate of Walter Reed, and I actually looked out the window and I saw protesters.
That's when the protesters were out there, Code Pink and all those anti-war people with their signs. Mm-hmm. And that's when my parents, we got involved with that. My parents would go out there and they'd be the counter protesters, the love you and support you groups. And they got the permit to bump those guys, let their permit lapse, and then the good guys got the permit, and then those guys got mad. They had to protest down the street. They couldn't be right in front of the gate.
Exactly. And that was that was a real down moment, was seeing those protesters, and then later going out and seeing the supporters out there was really amazing. And we're talking probably 3 months later, I walked out of the hospital, and one of the first things that I did was walk out the front gate. And actually, I wasn't even discharged from the hospital. I was like an inpatient that had freedom to walk around because I could walk again. And I walked out the front gate just to shake hands and say thank you. Because that meant so much to me that people were there supporting instead of protesting. Especially at a hospital, it wasn't like, anybody was in that hospital by choice. And, I had better things to see than protesters raging against me while I'm barely alive.
Yeah.
And it's embarrassing to me that people would think that that was okay.
Yeah.
That my fellow Americans, any of them, would think, yeah, that's good. That's okay. We'll protest our government by protesting the troops that are doing their jobs, that are literally fighting and dying to help another people. We'll protest the government by making those troops feel like nobody cares about them. But anyway, so I'm in the hospital. My wife is there. My mom is there. A great lady named Kathleen Bear, who's since passed away, was there. And she was there. She was with Soldiers Angels, and she was there. She's my soup lady. I wake up, and she's the first person I see. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, who are you? And she's like, hi, my name's Kathleen. I'm a volunteer with Soldiers Angels, and I just wanted to make sure that there was somebody here when you woke up. And I'm like, okay. And she said, do you want some soup? And yes, I do, because I haven't eaten anything in like 3 days. And so she's feeding me this chicken soup with, a little plastic spoon. And my lips had all been torn open by the blast as well. Like I said, everywhere that there wasn't body armor. And so I've got stitches in my lips. So half the soup is going down my face. But man, that was really, really, really good soup. And so my soup lady, she stayed to visit and became a great friend. And she just passed away last year, or the year prior. But she was, and that was the thing. She was there just so that when I woke up, I wouldn't be alone.
Yeah.
And there were volunteers that did that, because families have to travel, and you have to, where are the kids going to go? And so it took Karen probably another day to get to the hospital, and Kathleen introduced herself and said why she was there and everything. And she came back, all throughout the hospital visit or the hospital stay, and we stayed in touch and everything. But it was such a relief and comfort that, there's somebody there, not a nurse, not a doctor, just a person that's like, hey, I'm worried about you. And that meant a lot. And that was really, being wounded, as bad as it was, it really made me aware of a whole nother side of me and what I wanted to do with my life. Everybody's got a path charted in their head of where life is going to take them. And, you get wounded like I did, and that changes drastically. And, I still wanted to be in the Army. I stayed in the Army for another 12 years after being wounded, but I still wanted to serve. And I had all of these people that were supporting me in the hospital. I mean, they were supporting me overseas too, but these people that were volunteers, that were, nurses, doctors, medics, civilians that were willing. If you needed anything, they would find it. They would send it. They would support you, whatever you needed. And that really left a mark on me. And I started to work with these nonprofits after I got out of the hospital, and even while I was in the hospital. And you were part of that, Taco, with the Valor IT program, getting laptops that could be used by people that had, hand and eye injuries or amputations or anything like that, but that were controlled by their voice. We ended up doing
talk about that, because this was cutting edge technology to be able to assist folks.
Oh yeah, it was
sending an email. You used to send an email using that.
Yeah, just a microphone, and not just voice to text like on your phone. Like, you could control the mouse, and you could highlight, and you could edit text and open programs and do everything with just your voice. And it was absolutely cutting edge in 2005. And I remember asking for the, if anybody would send me a few bucks for the software. And the next morning, because I was blogging at the time, and I could type like maybe 2 sentences before I was either too tired or too stoned or too hurt to go on. The next morning, a guy sends me a note and says, "Hey, check your email." And boom, there's, Amazon. It's already been paid for, and where do you need it to ship to, and everything else. And I was like, wow, and then a headset and everything else. And I get this stuff in the mail, and Patty Bader from Soldiers Angels had sent me a laptop to begin with that I could use just for, keeping in touch with my guys. And I get this software and I install it, and I'm talking like gooned out of my skull on morphine and fentanyl and everything else. And I get this software up and running and working, and it was amazing. I wanted to stay awake longer. I wanted to engage with people. I didn't just want to lay in bed and like, okay, I'm just going to lay here and sleep because there's nothing to do, and I can't use my hands, and I can't see very well, and everything else. I could do things that I used to do. And then it dawned on me, well, why can't we do this for everybody else that's up here that can't use their hands or doesn't have them anymore, or that can't see or can't see very well? And Patty and her volunteer army took that and ran with it, and we developed Project Valor IT, which was voice-activated laptops for our injured troops. And it became laptops and other technology to assist with functionality and things like that. Truly adaptive and assistive technology. And eventually the DoD heard us and said, yeah, you're right, we should be providing this instead of people buying laptops on eBay and donating software. And now the DoD provides the laptops, they provide the software, they provide the training on the software. A guy comes to your hospital room and installs the software on your laptop for you and sits there and teaches you how to use it. We didn't have any of those things back in the Wild West days, but we got what we needed to the wounded, and that was a great thing. And so life happens, and I'm back, full-time work with the Army, and I'm off teaching cadets, and then I'm off, deploying to Afghanistan. And I really sort of I stayed in touch with folks, but I had to focus back on my life and my family and everything else. But that experience with a nonprofit and working for the greater good left such an impact on me that when I did retire from the Army, I was pretty much decided that I was going to work on something that had changed my life as I recovered, and that was a service dog. I'd had a service dog in 2006. My wife got me a little puppy, and my brother-in-law was a dog trainer and taught me how to train a dog to be a service dog. And he had picked out, a dog that would absolutely be a bulldozer of a dog. He was going to be big and solid, so he would help me with mobility. He was going to be playful and energetic, so he would get me up and moving. He was going to be smart. He was going to be empathetic to my needs, and Major was all of those things. He was a great service dog.
Was he over in Hawaii when I came over to see you? Did you guys have him, or you have Ilea?
Yeah, we had Major at that point. Yeah, and so I had this dog for about 6 years, and then I deployed to Afghanistan, and he stayed at home. And while I was deployed, he had a liver condition that was genetic, and he passed away. And it happened in like a week. And it wasn't something that people were really testing for back then. And actually, people weren't really even doing DNA testing on dogs back then.
Right.
This is 2011, 2012. And so I come back to Hawaii, which, I mean, great place to have to come back to after Afghanistan. And I tell my wife about 4 or 5 months after I get back, I was like, I really miss having my dog. And I want to get another one. And she was absolutely. And so the big problem in Hawaii is that you can bring a goat to Hawaii, you can bring a horse to Hawaii, you can bring any mammal you want to Hawaii without restrictions, except for dogs and cats. Those have to be quarantined for rabies. Everything else, just bring it on over. Because apparently only dogs and cats can carry rabies. Well, you can't get a puppy and then stick it in a quarantine for 4 to 5 months. You'll end up with a really, really maladjusted dog. So I was limited to breeders in Hawaii for Labrador Retrievers, not the most popular dog there. I found one over on the Big Island, went and visited her when the litter was really small, sort of picked out the puppy that I wanted, and then came back about a month later and actually picked up Halia, who I then raised and trained and was an even better companion than Major had ever been. I mean, Major was absolutely great, but Halia filled the hole that was left when he was gone and expanded to be so much more of a service dog and partner for me. So that problem, that in between there, Major and Halia, what I was really looking at was the different service dog training programs around the country, whether it was a for-profit program that would have run me about $50,000 for a dog, which I couldn't stomach spending that on a service dog, especially not with the money I was making and with 2 kids that I knew I was going to have to put through college. I can't go spending, half of a house on a dog. Yeah. Or I would work with, a nonprofit to get a service dog either at cost or for no cost. Well, the problem there was a 2 to 3 year long waiting list to get a service dog. And I'm like, all right, so why is there such a long wait? Well, one, it takes 2 years to train a service dog. And I was like, okay, so if you have a bench, right, of say 20 dogs that are trained, you can service veterans and keep your dogs in training separated by a few months. And as they finalize their training, you're pushing them out, yada, yada, yada. And so why do you not have a logistics train that supports this? Well, about 2/3 or between 2/3 and 75% of all dogs that enter service dog training fail because not every dog can do the work. Okay, so I thought on that. I retired and I went to work in Dallas for about a year, and then me and the company I worked for didn't see eye to eye on how to do coaching and counseling with people.
And, I imagine with your attitude, with your sense of humor, it was a wire brushing every now and then, a sarcastic wire brushing.
And people don't respond well to that in the civilian world. I never raised my voice, but if you're a fuck up, I'll tell you you're a fuck up, because it takes one to know one. And so I leave that job and I looked at Karen. I said, I really just want to breed Labrador Retrievers to be service dogs. And she said, okay. I said, who are you? Where's my wife? Because it's a harebrained idea, right? And her just saying, yeah, go for it. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, you married way above your pay grade. Me too, but
dude, I'm punching so far above the weight class, it's not funny.
Yeah.
But so I get the I had a Halia, and I knew that I wanted her genes. Her genetics were phenomenal, and I wanted to replicate as much of her as I could. And I talked to several breeders, and I found one up in Maryland that was like, I think what you want to do is absolutely great. And what I wanted to do was breed dogs specifically for service dog traits and qualities: aptitude, empathy, intelligence, demeanor, and the right size. And she's like, I get what you want to do. I think it's a great idea. Nobody else is really doing this, and I have the perfect stud dog for you. And she really did. She had a stud dog that was a phenomenal match with Halia. And Halia produced Polar Bear and 2 other pups that were, we kept Polar Bear as he was going to be our foundation stud dog. And then I went and I purchased another puppy named Nani. and purchased a couple more puppies after that, and and then another breeder who had found out what I was doing about a year or so later gave me a girl, gave me pick of the litter on their girls, and said, "We want you to use her in your breeding program." And I've we started with a litter of, I think, 3 puppies, and then it was a litter of 5, and then it was a litter of 7 as I got better at breeding and timing and everything else, and working with the right vets, and the girls grew to the age, and Polar Bear grew to the age where he could breed, and we got all their health clearances done, which is really much more involved than you would think if you're being an ethical breeder. And so there's health clearances and checkups and genetic testing and hips and elbows and eyes and yada yada yada, and training all of those dogs as well to act as service dogs, because a big part of my belief was that puppies are going to learn from the behaviors of the pack even when they're small, and they're being imprinted with what's right, what's wrong, how to act, how to behave. Right. And I want dogs that not only are working as my service dogs or able to work as a service dog, but also taking that empathy, that intelligence, and that drive and applying it to the puppies as well. Because I'm convinced that service dogs see me as their big dumb puppy that they have to help. So if they'll help me, they'll help their own puppies. And that's been pretty accurate. And so I continued to breed, continued to refine methods and tools and everything else, and work the dogs, and start a nonprofit and figure out, how to run a nonprofit and all of the needs and all of the things that you have to do for that, and where's the money going to come from, and how are we going to fundraise it? What are we going to do? And at the core of it, it's been, I'm going to breed service dogs for nonprofit programs. I'm going to donate those dogs absolutely free of charge to the programs, covering everything from birth all the way through vet appointments, all the way through delivery. They don't even pay for gas when I take these dogs to the programs. And and if we have a dog fail out of a program, then maybe it's the training technique that program uses, and maybe the behavior can be fixed at a program that trains differently, or maybe it's just the dog needs a little bit more time to mature sometimes. Or maybe that dog isn't a very good candidate for a service dog, but is a good candidate for a facility dog, working with a police department, that engaging with the community instead of being the attack dog that gets put out on the bad guys. Or maybe working at a university or an elementary school or in a fire department, and really helping victims of trauma and being almost like a first responder themselves. The dogs are great in that capacity.
How many dogs have you guys put out so far over the years?
To date, we have produced 157 puppies. Man, of those, less than 10 have failed out completely of programs.
Well, I put Hero Labradors right below me here. So and I got that right, HeroLabradors.org.
Yes.
HeroLabradors.org. So
my glasses. Put on my old man specs. Yes, that's right.
Yep. So if you guys want to contribute, you need you're looking for a great charity to support, please support Chuck and all the volunteers that help out here with HeroLabradors.org. You're going to produce a fantastic animal that is going to a worthy and needy vet who needs this. I mean, like I said, I've known Chuck for years. I went over to visit in Honolulu, and you had Major with you, and just the miracle of technology. Show just a miracle that you have your arm, that they were able to reattach and put you back together again.
I got a broken gun, but yeah, I got better.
Yeah, but you know what? You're yeah. Live long and prosper. Yeah. All right. I got before we finish, I gotta let your sense of humor has always been the greatest thing that attracts me to you. I love your sense of humor. And for those that don't know, when you're over in a Middle Eastern country at like 7 a.m., at noon, at 5 o'clock, at 10 o'clock, the wailing goes, and it's the call to prayer, and the mosque light up, and the sirens go off, and everybody goes out and they put the rug out and they do their deal. Well, all right, tell the story, man. It's funny
All
as
right.
hell.
So Afghanistan is a weird place. I mean, aside from being stuck in like the mid 1400s, they even have their own time zone. They're like a half an hour off of everybody else in that time zone just because they want to be.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so you guys are just going to do what you want to at the clock. And yeah, they play the azan like 5 times a day, and it really gets annoying. And I'm stuck on this Afghan border patrol base where their brigade headquarters is. And so I'm living there and working with them and everything. And I noticed that the thing that plays the azan, the call to prayer, is like this little machine that's off in the corner that nobody ever messes with. And so I go and look at it, and it's really easy to figure out how to set the times for when it goes off. So what the hell? Let's just start bumping the times up, a minute or so a day. And eventually I basically get them on time with everybody else in the world. And, but the call to prayer is going off, and people are like, man, it is really early. The sun isn't even up yet. And the call to prayer is going off. We got to trot over to the mosque and pray. And yeah, I just did that for my own fun and amusement. And I don't know that they ever actually fixed it. And no, they did. I fixed it. That's right. Because one day I changed everything back. So everything happened like 30 minutes later. And people are like, it's getting dark now, and there's the call to prayer. Or isn't it lunchtime? And yeah, and that's one of those things that I did. I never told anybody about that was with me, but I just thought it was hilarious. And another thing, they have those the squatty potty toilets.
Yeah.
Well, the ones that the Afghans had, they weren't real big on cleaning those, and so they're always messy, always really nasty, like one of the worst things you can imagine having to do. But they were porcelain. They had these little foot grip things that were porcelain, and all of the Afghans, if they weren't wearing their combat boots, they were wearing flip-flops. Well, April Fool's Day rolls around, and I don't really have a whole lot going on, but there's one of these latrines that's like 2 doors down from where I'm working, and it's like 4 stalls. And I go and get a can of Pam from the kitchen, and I just spray it on those little grip tread things for their feet. And then I sit back in my office and I listen to people fall and stumble all day as they're trying to go to the bathroom.
Oh my God.
It's one of those things. Every time I'd hear, I would just start cracking up, and people are like, what are you laughing about? I'm like, I just thought of something really funny. The guys would come out of the bathroom all mad because they've been rolling around in filth. And yeah. In Iraq, we'd always find, the local nationals using the porta-johns that we had because we didn't have any plumbing. We didn't care if they were using the porta-johns, but they would squat on the seats to go to the bathroom.
Right.
And they would leave like dirty footprints all over the seats and everything. And we're like, come on, But they kept doing it, and they would always leave a bottle of water in there to wash with when they were done.
And of course, the water was everywhere.
Yeah. Oh yeah, but they would leave these giant, 1.5 liter bottles in the porta john so they could wash with. Well, if you put Tabasco in that water, and you don't put a whole lot in, just enough, you can't really tell what's in the water, especially in a dark porta john. But man, those little dudes can zip across the fob looking for fresh water after that. Because the Iraqis, they do not like, and a lot of the third country nationals did not like spicy food at all. Like they literally considered Altoids to be like super spicy.
Yeah.
And then here I am putting Tabasco on their butts. But fun to watch, So, that's the kind of the sense of humor that I had with a lot of things. It's like, oh yes, we have to be culturally sensitive, yes. But if I can screw with people, I'm going to take the chance.
You are the ugly American. You're the epitome of the ugly American, and I love you for it, man. I love it.
Well, I guess the lesson that they never learned was that a bored chuck is a bad thing. And I think I paid for a lot of my bad karma all at once. so I had to go back into debt somehow, right? And and I pulled the same kind of things, on my coworkers when I wasn't deployed. I mean, not hot sauce in the wash water, but just other random office kind of prank things. I did that for my own amusement most of the time.
Yeah. Oh God. We actually, you know what? I'll bring you back on for a segment, and we'll just talk about practical jokes that we played on our guys.
Well, I need to think on that because memory's getting a little foggy. But I think without too many specifics, I think the best practical jokes were always the ones that you could pull that nobody knew that you were doing the prank.
Yeah.
And oftentimes nobody knew that they were actually being pranked. But there are also ones that are much more blatant and obvious. And this one happened after I retired. So the 25th Infantry Division had a phone system, right? It was run by the computer, but when they needed to alert a unit or the entire division, basically the staff duty officer would hit, or not the staff duty, the field officer of the day would hit like 2 buttons on the computer and could send out a crafted message to the entire division.
Mm-hmm.
And go out on phones, you get a call, you get a text message, however you want to set it up. Well, as I'm leaving Hawaii, like we're getting on the plane, I pull out my cell phone, and I'm completely retired at this point. Terminal leave's over. I am Mr. Ziegenfuss. I pull out my phone, and I'm like, I wonder if I still have access to this. Like, I'm sitting in the Honolulu airport. I wonder if I still have access to this system. Sure enough, I still had access to the system.
Oh, God.
I didn't call anybody into work, but I did send out a telephonic alert message to wait for further instructions. This is a tropic thunder alert, and I didn't call it a tropic lightning alert. So first clue was it was a tropic thunder alert.
Right.
Shelter in place, wait further instructions. That was the alert. And I got on the plane and left. And about 5 months goes by, and I hadn't even thought of this, right? I just had a chuckle and realized that I just probably screwed up some staff officer's day, or several staff officers. And then 5 months go by, I'm sitting in the living room, and I get a phone call. I'm like, yeah, hey, hello? And, oh, sir, this is Major so-and-so, 25th Infantry Division, Field Officer of the Day, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, what can I help you with?
Did you?
No, not a did you. He said, so I'm reviewing the SOP. We've got to send out an alert, and it says if we have any questions to call you. So they haven't even updated the SOP in like 6 months, or probably. Right. No, I wrote that SOP when I was still working in the Division Operations Center, so they hadn't updated it in over 3 years. And right. my cell phone number is still in there. Because the only way for me to avoid being like called back into work was to put my personal cell number in the SOP.
Right.
So they never updated. So I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, so what are you having problems with? And the guy tells me, what's going on, and asked me for advice on who to call. And I was like, okay. And I don't really remember what the incident was, but it was something really minor. But it was a very new major that was calling and asking, grizzled old retired major for advice, not realizing that I was grizzled old retired major.
Yeah.
They thought I was just the guy that wrote the SOP. I'm like, oh, okay. So he's asking for advice, and it's something that, as a duty officer, I would consider it. This is a minor thing. Call the G3, call the chief of staff, let them know, and decide what to do with it. Right? Now, man, that's priority intelligence reporting. You need to report that directly to the commanding general.
You told him that?
Oh yeah. I'm like, call his cell phone. I'm like, before you call anybody else, you need to let him know all of the information that you have right now. And he was like, okay. I was like, and afterward, then you can call the chief of staff and the G3 and yada, yada, yada. I knew who the chief of staff was at that point, and I did not like the guy.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's get him yelled at from 2 points. One, he'll get yelled at by the CG of, why is this guy calling me directly? Or why don't you know anything that's going on in my division? The duty officer is calling me directly. And then the chief is going to have to turn around and say, why did you call me directly, or call the CG and not call me? And the duty officer is going to say, I was following your SOP. So then the chief has to go back and say, well, we didn't update the SOP for the last 4 years. So I got to screw with all of these people simply by telling the guy, yeah, you should just call the CG on that because that's important.
Oh, God,
You know,
you're an ass.
Well, you should know who you're calling when you ask for advice. You know, he could have asked anybody else in the division operations shop. He could have called the G3. He could have called the chief of staff. He could have, I don't know, maybe talked to his NCO and said, who should I call? Because nobody in their right mind, and he should have known as a major, you don't call the CG directly with information.
Yeah.
You always call the people that usually work with him to say, hey, got this going on. This is what I'm doing. What do you think?
Yeah.
So that they can tell the CG, hey, I know about what's going on in your division. And that's a minor thing, you know. Sometimes it was simple things like, ThinkGeek used to make a device called the Annoyatron, right? And it was this little computer card with a battery on it that at different times would beep or chirp or just make a noise, right? Very, very brief noise and pretty quiet. And it would do it at random intervals. And that battery would last for months. Well, so I had this boss who did not play well with others, was very verbally abusive to subordinates, especially the younger the subordinate. And so I got really tired of him beating up brand new second lieutenants verbally. And, you know, trying to take as many of the rounds to my chest as I can for those guys, but he would just come in and just like really degrade and humiliate them for no reason. And I had noticed that he had a scar ran down the back of his neck. And so I was just asked him about it one day in a casual conversation. He's like, oh, well, I used to wrestle and I broke my neck wrestling. And so they had to fuse all of the vertebrae. He goes, that's why I always turn like this, because I can't turn my head.
Yeah.
Okay, so I filed that one away. And this is when I was in ROTC. And at the end of the summer, everybody takes their GSA vehicles that belong back at the universities, and they drive them, you know, to their university. Well, his university was all the way across the country, much like mine was. So at the end of the summer, I get in his GSA vehicle and I take the headrest off of his driver's seat. And, you know, you can peel back the cover on it, and I slide one of those Annoyatrons in there. Because the other thing was, like, if your watch beeped around this guy, he'd lose his shit, because that's not tactical, right? So I put this thing, I put this thing in his headrest that beeps at random intervals. That's always going to be somewhere behind him, and he can't turn his head to even look to see where he goes. And he's got like a 4-day drive ahead of him.
Oh my God.
So I can be funny. I can also be funny and vindictive. And I did that just because I didn't like the guy, you know.
Well, I'm glad
you. The reason then this is going to drive him nuts the whole way across the country. Yeah, that'll be
good. Did you ever hear about his adventure?
He actually drove back with one of the NCOs from his ROTC detachment, who knew what I was up to.
Yeah.
And the guy was like, I would usually be in the back, like sleeping, while he was up front losing his mind over this thing beeping. And like they would stop for the evening, or anytime they stopped for a meal, dude would tear through the truck looking for whatever in the hell was beeping, like over and over and over and over. Like as soon as they got back, he's like, this thing needs to go back to the GSA lot. Tell them there's something wrong with it, yada, yada, yada. So they would take it to the GSA lot. GSA guys would check it out and be like, there's nothing wrong with this vehicle. Take it back. So they wouldn't replace it. And eventually it got to the point where this guy was just not going to use that vehicle.
Oh God, that is hilarious. Well, I would
it's like a $10 gift that I gave him.
You know, here's my emotional support animal here. Yeah, see, man, that's my support animal right there. Thank you so much, Chuck. You got a good sense of humor. No, listen, man, it's been an hour and 35 minutes, and I can't thank you enough for coming on. Dude, I love you. And
love you.
I hope everybody, if you want to support one of the greatest guys going, right there, herolabradors.org, all right?
We absolutely appreciate all of your support.
Well, brother, I will talk to you soon. All right.
All
Give
right,
your-
man.
Give your wife a hug, and I'll talk to you soon. Hoorah.
All right, you too. Take care.
Out here. Bye.
Bye.
Folks, oh my God. I'm crying right now. Anyway, listen, seriously, if you can support Chuck and Hero Labradors, they're a great organization. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Tall Tales with Taco Bell, and we will see you again next week. Adios, hasta luego, wiedersehen, tschüss, shishini, au revoir, dominigato gozaimasu, tando shinde al kudasai, ciao, arrivederci, tashikor, assalamu alaikum, bahala, do widzenia, das vidania. Until next week. We'll see you guys. You all take care. Let's see what should we play. I think I'm going to do nighttime. Hoorah.